Hey folks, it's Tony here, back with another video, and as always, I would like to welcome you to my collecting journey. So today, I wanted to share a little bit more about actually something that I have been observing. So a little bit of context is my profession is actually what's called a UX designer or a product designer. And what we do is we basically design websites and applications. We basically draw a lot of squares and boxes and put text on pages and think about the layout of these digital experiences. We also think about things like business needs and user needs and try to solve these problems and tie everything together to make a product that people can enjoy and benefit from, and that's also feasible for the engineers to implement. And why I think that is like kind of relevant to Pokemon cards is because Pokemon cards are designers are very similar. And I'll get right into it. For example, I think this is just my hypothesis. I think the people who design Pokemon cards, just like the layout of the card is like slightly different than obviously the individual illustrators of the cards, right? Like it's mentioned here in the bottom of the cards, like who the illustrators are. And I think that's like a really cool feature. So I'm not that type of designer, like that those are sort of called visual designers. I'm more of the type of designer that thinks about like scalability. Like if we have this layout, will it work across all of these different types of cards? And how many different types of cards are there? So for example, there's Pokemon cards, like just some of these cards that I pulled from a Temporal Forces pack. So these are the Pokemon cards, and then there are trainer cards, and then there's basic energy, right? So that's pretty simple. But then within Pokemon cards, obviously you have basic Pokemons, like the lowest level of evolution. And then you have, like, as the evolution goes up, it shows you the previous evolution. So that's like one detail. And they even have to leave a little space here that shows who they evolved from, right? And then obviously there are different attributes that you need to incorporate, just like really interesting. And then you need to make sure that like the color contrasts properly for all of these. And then the layout wise, yeah, like how all of the information about their attacks, it needs to not be super long, right? If we see here, I'm not sure if you guys can see, if we try to line up, you can see here, Flock, the skill, is actually a little bit higher than Low Sweep, right? And that's because Flock has a 2-line description. And a lot of times there's a content person probably working on this that needs to make sure that it's coherent and it's not too long. So then we sort of see that these two skills, most of the time Pokemon have 2 skills, they're like centered on the page, at least in this section. So they're not they're not all like, a few inches from the top. They're all centered in the middle of the page, which is really interesting. And then, yeah, if the attack does have damage, it's anchored on the right like that. Which I just started looking at Pokemon cards. I just thought it's like super interesting. Like if you're a illustrator or an artist, obviously you're just concerned about the Pokemon inside. But I think what's also really interesting is like just being a designer of Pokemon cards, And then why I mentioned, working with engineers is because ultimately the design of the card needs to be able to be printed, So for really complicated cards like these, like, SIRs or SARs, where the art is basically bleeding into the rest of the card, I think that is actually really interesting because and then not to mention the textures, right? Like when you're designing the Pokemon card, how does the texture get get created? I think I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is also super interesting. And yeah, so we talked about like these different types of Pokemon cards, and then you have trainer cards that are slightly different. They definitely share similarity. So for reference, let's take one Pokemon card, one trainer card, and one energy card, right? We see here that the energy card and the trainer card have a label, right? It says energy and trainer, but the Pokemon card doesn't. And I think that's like a pretty interesting design decision, because the Pokemon card obviously doesn't need a label because it's obvious that it's a Pokemon, right? Like, as opposed to a trainer, especially in educating, new players about the game, like you maybe you need a little bit more education. And also the descriptions here, you know, yeah, this is actually something I noticed. Like, there's very specific descriptions about what the Pokemon does. It's kind of like a default description, like it doesn't have any significant value. It just is a cool fact, right, about these normal cards. Like the Scorch fact. When it heats up, its body temperature reaches about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. It lashes its body like a whip and launches itself at enemies. That's pretty cool. But then for trainer cards or support cards, you actually have like a rule here, like a hard rule. Like you may play only one supporter card during your turn. Even for this Palkia V-Star, right? You see here, V-Star rule. When your Pokemon V-Star is knocked out, your opponent takes 2 prize cards. So it's like this place in the bottom right was reserved for important information, and when it doesn't, it's used as a place for a cool fact, which I think is really interesting. And then for the trainer card and the basic energy card, the basic energy card, nothing super crazy. I mean, it has like the logo here of the energy, and then also up here, which I think is interesting. I'm actually not sure why they didn't spell out like that this is fighting energy, and as opposed to using the symbol, maybe just for simplicity. But yeah, that's like an interesting thing. And then they both have this sort of little crevice. That's like a very common visual pattern that I've seen. It's also used here. And then the trainer card, I don't have too many trainer cards, but you see this like little notch here, right? I'm actually curious what that is. I need to get more trainer cards to sort of compare them. And then of course you got short one-line descriptions. I think one thing that is really interesting is growing up, I was always more into Yu-Gi-Oh than Pokemon. I was a really big Yu-Gi-Oh kid. If you guys are, please let me know. I really love Elemental Heroes and Crystal Beasts. But I always felt like, Yu-Gi-Oh had a lot of texts, which was cool because the game of Yu-Gi-Oh is just there. It's just more complicated. That's just like, there's no other way to put it. But Pokemon really tries to keep it simple. It's like one line. Like it's really hard to find places where they use more than 2 sentences per ability. It's all 1 sentence abilities, and I think that's like a really good intentional thing that they've done. And then really cool here is that the V-Star power section or the ability gets a special section or header. I think the V-Star card is just really great overall. Obviously, we can start talking about that a little bit. Obviously, the card is gold, which is great. From Crown Zenith, the border of the other cards are yellow. And then, you have the 4 golds, which just elevates and builds on the theme of the yellow borders. And then the background obviously plays really nicely with the gold. And then you have these 2 sort of, I don't know what you call it. It's a really nice contrast though. It feels like maybe like a knight's armor, or the cloth of comparing the cloth with the armor. Maybe that's how you could interpret it. And then you sort of got these 2 here in the top left and bottom right. And then you have yeah, the V star power as a header here, sort of anchored in the middle, and then again you have the white here that is elevating the content here, which I think is really, really cool. Yeah, and then the V star, the V is also that same white, so they have a lot of consistency throughout this page, which provides like nice hints of emphasis, which I think is really interesting. You know, they could have done, they could have used that texture on other aspects of the card like the ability, but it wasn't as important, so they didn't do that. You know, it was just a normal glitter effect, which is really cool. But yeah, I just wanted to quickly talk a little bit about the design of Pokemon cards and how it sort of reminded me of my job, because as a UX or product designer, a lot of my day is like thinking about, you know, layouts on a phone and a website and stuff like that. And I was just like looking at Pokemon cards, I was like, you know, sort of see like how people were thinking when they were designing Pokemon cards. You know, they definitely have a lot of constraints. You know, they have to design for so many scenarios. I mean, like the modern designers, like the designers, for example, who are designing the Team Rocket set, or who did design the Team Rocket set, it's probably not that hard, but like maybe sometimes you have to break conventions that have been set before, you know? Like I bet like the first time a crazy card like this popped up, they were like, oh shoot, like where do we like where do we show, how do we sort of highlight like that unique power that they have, you know, and stuff like that. Like we're really like making this section really, really tight. Like you could argue, right? Like this description section is much more dense. And, you know, at some point, for example, Pokemon made the decision to go from just like a window frame illustration like this to a full art. And that was probably really like groundbreaking, because they're like, no, we need to incorporate like all of the art to make the card even more unique and special. And it's really about the art of the card and letting that speak for itself, you know. And like at some point they went like, okay, maybe we want to break this and really change the framing of the previous Pokemon. You know, so in some of the base set cards and the older cards, it's sort of like a square, and then it breaks out of the. It sort of looks like somebody punching a hole through a piece of paper, and then over time they really played around with different ways of visualizing that as well. So I think I could go on and on about how there's probably so many decisions that were made. And then the last thing is just like, you know, yeah, like talking about prints and stuff like that. You know, not every single card is perfect. So then that's like another part that I thought was interesting, because it's like, you know, sometimes as a designer, you may have intended a card to look a certain way, for example, for it to be printed in the center, but then it doesn't get printed in the center. You know, stuff like that, which is also just a part of the process as somebody who is designing something. But yeah. Oh, and then also I didn't notice this thing as well. There's like a little description about the weight and height and some stats about the Pokemon, you know. And for example, in here, it's not here, right? Like they had to make that decision. I don't think it's here. But let me know if you guys see it. Yeah, I don't think I see it. Yeah, we don't know how much Palkia V-Star weighs. Maybe it's on the Palkia V origin form card, but not the V-Star. So, yeah. Super interesting. But yeah, guys, that's that's about it. Just a quick video today. Thank you so much for watching as always, and supporting. And yeah, I'll catch you guys next time.